The last topic on our Pixera online training session is now going to be the Projector database. And this is going to be a mostly pure theoretical topic, as we cannot guarantee that all of you have projectors at hand in order to try out different stuff in here and in order to connect outputs and warp and so on. So we were just basic going through everything. And then if you have appropriate equipment at home, I would highly appreciate if you could try out some of the stuff you can find in here. Okay, now let's start. In order to get an image on something, I've quickly imported a generic flat screen, as you can see, with 1920 by 1080 pixels. And I will now browse my Projector database. As you can see, all manufacturers are present in here. And there is also generic as of the LED, if you don't want to use a certain manufacturer. And a quick way of doing things is when you go to live and select an output, if you have Projector selection enabled, if you drag and drop the output in your workspace, it will always create a generic projector. That's an easy way of importing something into the workspace. Now let's delete this again and let's browse the database. So let's say you are working with Panasonic projectors and you're working with the 16K most of the time. What you can do in here is you can right click on projectors and then add them to favorites. Now as I do so, my Panasonic projector will always be in my favorites in here, and this is stored over multiple projects. So this is a global setting, so to speak. Now, what I can do is I can now import it always here from my favorites. So importing is the same as in every other library. You just drag and drop it onto here. And now, as you can see, I've got my projector now in my workspace. Here on the top, you can deactivate the projector's body if you just want to work in a simple 2D manner, so to speak. Now let's take a look at some of the settings, or let's rather start here on the top. Here again, really important, here you can change between projector and screen selection. If I have this activated, I can only select the screen. As you can see, there's no way for me to select the projector now. If we take a quick look at the screens, we have the feed area overlap in here, something we're going to discuss in some minutes. You can launch the Panasonic Geo Pro calibration in here. We have direct Panasonic Geo Pro implementation in Pixera. There's a special software version you can get from Panasonic, and by using that you can launch it directly from Pixera. Then there is the Vioso calibration also hiding in here. You can launch a new calibration, add, load, clear, and edit current calibrations. For all of you who don't know Vioso is a close partner company from us. We're partners since, I guess, more than 10 years, definitely. They're doing calibration software, really awesome software tool, which you can buy as an add-on on your Pixera license. And it's mainly used for dome calibration, for example, but also flat curve screen. You can stack as many projectors as you want to, and yeah, it is really awesome workflow. And there is MPCDI calibration, with MPCDI as a general calibration format. And by using this, you can import stuff like dome calibration, for example. Now let's get back to projectors. Here again, our camera options. Here you can limit the aspect ratio of the viewport. That's if you want to render our content. Not important for us here. Here again, the dive in. It's also available in here. Test pattern, really important for projectors. You can display a test pattern here. Grid again. You can show labels. You can again deactivate the frustum. And here is the auto transform, which we'll also take a look at in some minutes. And last but not least, marker for marker calibration and measuring of position and distances. If you have this activated, you can measure the distance from the 0.0, basically from the origin point. Now, let's take a look at the projector's inspector. On the top, we find warp, Softedge, and marker. We're going to take a deeper look at that in some minutes. Down below, you can find the warp settings. And let's close this down. Here you can find the name. You can assign a name. Let's call this Projector 1, for example. You can assign an output. So I could assign the output in here. Or again, I could also do drag and drop. Just drag and drop it onto here. Now the output is assigned, as you can see. Then resolution, brightness, contrast, and world transformation. So in here I can now start and place my projector. Again, same workflows as in any other tab. Go a little bit back. Do some more precise placement. There we go. Case dimensions. In case, for example, you're using special cases for a projector, you can also change this. Local transformation, relative, and there's also lens properties. Again, in addition to the projectors, we also have a lens database. So you can basically change to any available lens of the projector. There we go. And of course, you can also modify stuff like throw ratio and lens shift. Now, let's assume our projector is projecting somewhere from here. You can increase the frustrum's length by holding the X button on the keyboard and by dragging this along. And now as I move this, I can also hit Shift in order to lock to my axis, as you can see. So I can now bring this up to my screen's position, as you can see. Now I can play around with the throw ratio as well as lens shift. There we go, and set it up to my needs. There we go. Last but not least, there is vocal offsets. Again, in case you have a special projector setup, you can basically offset the vocal point. There's market calibration mode for market calibration, and down below, special for Panasonic projectors, GeoPro login. So you can define the IP address as well as port, username, and password right here in order for the projector to sign up at the GeoPro application. Now let's take a look at Multiprojector Softedge application. Now in order to do so, I've just again imported a generic flat screen, and I will increase the size a little bit in order to get a widescreen projection. Now let's again advance to the mapping tab, and I will now take again the Panasonic DZ16K, which we have imported or added to our favorites just recently. Let's just drag and drop the projector on here. Now, of course, I could copy and paste Control C, Control V in order to get a second projector on here. However, Pixera also supports auto alignment, auto projector setup, automatic setup. And you can access this here on the top by clicking this auto transform editor, which looks something like this. And in here I can now tell the system in my alignment tab how many projectors I want to use. For example, I want to use 2 projectors. And I can also set this on preview, and now the system will set up everything for me in real time, and I can now start and adjust my projector setup. Set it to 20% in order to get the setup I want to. Let's go a little bit bigger, 25, 22. Yeah, this looks pretty good. Now I can hit apply, and as you can see now, both of my projectors are now set up. Now, what you can see in here are those blue lines, and those blue lines indicate that auto transform, sorry, not auto transform, but the optimized feed area is activated for my projectors. You can activate and deactivate the setting down here. And technically speaking, that's something that's an option that is really advanced. To sum it up, when you activate this, and it is activated by default on regular screens and curved screens, it will help you a lot on setup of those two types of projections, because the placement of the projectors in space actually is not all too important anymore, because the system always feeds the correct pixel amounts into your projector. Now, let's start and take a look at the warping tab. Now, in order to do so, I will activate the test pattern. If you don't want to work with the test pattern, you can also warp on content. So let me quickly put something in here, set the scale to fill, so we are full screen. And as you can see, when I deactivate this, and now when I select the projector on the right hand side, you can see here on my warping grid that I can now warp on the content. But for now, let's go back to the test grid. Here on the right side, you can of course increase the window here, and on here you can find your warp window. And in here you can now do your optical distortion of the image, and as you can see, as I do this, there is also perspective correction immediately applied. Down below you can find your modifiers, your FFD modifiers. There are two different warp modifiers available in Pixera. The FFD warping, which is called freeform deformers, which you can see right here. It's more or less like when you would put a rubber band on top of your screen, and when you pull something, everything will follow along. And you can also change on the vertice modes, which you can select here by clicking on Edit Mesh. Now when I click it again, it's deactivated. Now once I click one more time, we're back into our FFD modifier. Now down below, we find some more options. These here on the top we will discuss in the next part. Let's take a look at the FFD modifiers, and here you can add segments. So I can add, for example, more segments in order to do more warping. And I can also reset the control points if I like to. Now, what I can do in here is I can now flip this warp image over, which you can find, or which you can do by pressing this button here on the top. Now, as you do this, you can see I've now got a lot more space in my workspace for my warp modifications. And if you go to project, you can now see your projectors and cycle through your projectors. So you can now go in here and also add some more points in order to do my warping, as you can see. And by doing so, I can now change between my two outputs in order to quickly switch back and forth to do my warping. Now, the next tab we're going to discuss is Softedge, which you can access here. And on Softedge, you can, of course, create your Softedge. This here will generate the Softedge automatically, which it will do for setups where the feed modes are activated. That's a mandatory point in here. And I could now also go in here and start adding my Softedge. Now in here we also follow a similar concept with inner and outer compositing. As you can see, you can also find a dive in button in here. Now the view you see here is your workspace view, so you will always manage and edit your Softedge directly on the 3D model, so to speak. if you don't want to, and if you want to go on to or if you want to edit the Softedge rather in a 2D texture way, you can also dive in here, and in here I can now see my whole screen, and I can now place my Softedge here on my 2D texture level. Let's flip this one also over to get a little bit better view. Now I can add additional Softedge masks in here, and of course I can resize them. And I can also cycle through different edit modes with my pencil here on the top. And when I double click in here, I can also add multiple points. Now, if I don't want to add a Softedge mask, but rather a mask to blank out different parts, I can find some more options over here. There is the gradient, which changes the gradient. And if I deactivate this checkbox here, I now have a black mask. So I can completely mask out this part of the screen. Now let's take a look at the last settings we can find here in our warping tab in the inspector. In order to do so, I've prepared a little bit bigger setup. I've got 2 projectors shooting at a projection here on the back, and I've got 1 projector projecting at the front of the sphere, generic sphere, which I've just added into my workspace. Now, as you can see, the projector here on the top is basically projecting through the sphere also onto the back of our projection screen. Now, the first thing I'd like to showcase is, again, our auxiliary warp engine. Now, here's a lock 2D button, which you can deactivate. And I can now, by pressing Alt, like I would on my regular setup, turn my my viewport here, and as you can see, our warp engine in here is actually also its own 3D engine. So the warper supports multiple screens as well as full 3D models here in our warping section. Now let's say I want to remove the back screen from my projector, which is projecting here in this direction. I can do this by choosing the setting screen visible for projector. Now I can cycle here between the screens I have active, and I want this projector only to be visible for the sphere. Now what I can do is I can now change to my generic flat. That's my flat screen here on the bottom. Let's add the notification here, generic flat. I can deactivate the mapping, and as you can see now, I only got I'm only left with my sphere in here. What's missing now is the bypass warping. That's a rather quick one. If you activate this one here, it will just simply completely bypass the warp engine.